Do you ever take a step back and wonder what the history books will make of this period? Division inside and outside the House of Commons, MPs resigning, defecting and being chucked out of their own parties, snap elections, that's 3 in 4 years, including the one in December, and of course Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament for much longer than usual. It's not exactly normal, is it? I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and today on Chopper's Election podcast, we're asking, how will history judge Brexit? And to help answer that question, I'm joined by one of the most famous TV historians out there, Dr. David Starkey, who's written more books about the Tudors than you can count on both hands, and is a regular contributor to BBC One's Question Time, and in the past, The Moral Maze on Radio 4. And you may not know this, but David Starkey also stood as a Tory candidate in 2 council wards in the late 80s and early 90s. David, how do you think history will judge Brexit?
Unfortunately, history only works in one direction. Let's be really pompous to begin with. T.S. Eliot said, "Only in retrospection, selection, can you say that was the day." Brexit is not yet over. Brexit has not yet happened. It is by no means clear that Brexit will happen. So I'm afraid history may well record this as a triumphant beginning, an abortion, an accident. We don't know until it's done.
What we do know is that 17.4 million people voted for it.
No, we know all that.
Let's start with that vote.
We also know that for the last 2.5 years, that voters, every single possible thing has been done by most of the political establishment to defeat that vote.
Is there an example in history where people have voted for one thing overwhelmingly and the elite has refused to do it?
Not so much as a result of a direct vote. I think what's happened really since 2016 is unique. In other words, since the beginnings of universal suffrage, roughly 1884, a vote has been respected, even when it was a vote that threatened to overturn the established order. Sometimes there was resistance, for example, to the beginning of the welfare state, which is not, as we all think, in 45, it's 1908.
Yes, with the Pensions Act.
With that, and with the enormous increase of taxation that was involved with that, and the resistance of the Lords. And the Lords did not finally capitulate until after 2 general elections, but capitulate they did. What we're seeing now is something, I think, much more like the resistance to the beginning of universal franchise. In other words, the resistance before the Reform Act of 1832, the fight to the death over the Reform Act of 1832.
And what did that do? That gave the vote to who?
Well, before the Reform Act of 1832, right, let's get all of this very straight. You've made the mistake of calling a historian on the programme. You're going to get some history. And unlike Nick Robinson, you will shut up and listen to it. Right. Parliamentary government is ancient. Parliamentary government, that is government involving a fundamental role for a legislative assembly, goes right back to the aftermath of Magna Carta. It goes back to the 13th century. But there's a very important caveat. This does not mean democracy. Only a tiny proportion of the population had a vote, but they theoretically represent everybody.
How many people?
Right, let's get this straight again. Parliament very quickly comes to assume its modern form. So you have a House of Lords that consists of the bishops and the titled nobles. It's tiny, 100 and odd people, minute. You've then got, very quickly, something like a House of Commons with several hundred people, already several hundred sitting in it, representing 2 groups. Representing the counties. There are separate seats for the counties. They're the prestige seats. And then there are seats for the boroughs, for the townsfolk. The 2 houses have very similar powers to the present. But what you've got to remember is that the electorate for the county seats, the electorate for the boroughs, well, it varies again. In the counties, they're often very big. everybody with 40 shillings worth of land, which doesn't sound, that's £2. It doesn't sound very much, multiplied by several thousand. So in other words, reasonably substantial farmers. Some towns, everybody who was a householder had the vote. Others, it's actually owned by an aristocrat. But in theory, there's this wonderful phrase of the judges: everybody is represented in Parliament, either in person or by his representative. That's the theory.
And in 1832, what happened?
1832, for the first time, you begin to have an act of conscience about how really representative Parliament is. Let's just fill in one other gap, because it's one of the outstanding misunderstandings of the last 2.5 years. What is Parliament for? Is Parliament there, basically, as John Bercow thought, to stop government doing things? Is its role to hold the government to account? This is not true. Parliament in England, please, this is what it is. Scots sort of come in, as usual, late in the day and try to reap the benefit. The English Parliament is unusual in that it's an instrument of government. What is striking is that it's the strong kings who add to the power of Parliament. Why do they do it? Because it's the easy way of raising taxation. Isn't it odd? People pay tax when they're asked to politely. If you try to screw it out of them by force, they resist. So it's the powerful kings, the imperial kings, Edward I, who fights the Scots and the Welsh, Edward III, who fights the French. They're the ones who add to the power.
So Burke got it wrong on
Burke gets it fundamentally wrong. Parliament is an instrument of government. And this is why the English and then the British Parliament survives. If you look, every country in Western Europe had a parliament. They all go. Why? Because they get in the way. Parliaments have traditionally been associated with inefficiency, incompetence, and behaving exactly like our parliament.
So he's a revolutionary, Bercow, isn't he, in that sense?
Well, he's a counter-revolutionary. Bercow is an ancient reactionary. And we need to understand this. And again, there's also something else. The Parliament, as it developed from 1832 onwards, it changes fundamentally. Once you actually, in 1832, begin to get the notion of, well, we better broaden the base of representation. There are two things very striking about this. Everywhere else in Europe, parliaments are attacked as part of the old establishment. In Britain, the reason that our constitution survives across 800 years is that the people, that's going well down the social scale, didn't want to destroy Parliament. They wanted a voice in Parliament. And this is if you look at the French Revolution is wanted to tear down the whole structure of the Ancien Regime because they felt it was corrupt, unrepresentative, unreformable. In England, that's not the case. There are no revolutionary movements. What they all want to do is to participate in the show.
That's the British way of doing things.
Well, it becomes...
Or the English way of doing things.
It becomes that. But what it involves is exactly what the political elite has not shown for the last 2.5 years. It's a willingness to give way before popular pressure. And finally, that's what happens until the last 2.5 years. But we've forgotten something else.
What's that?
Which is how Parliament was made responsive to democracy. Parliament's made responsive to real democracy, the equivalent of the vote for the working man. And oddly enough, that's introduced by a conservative. That's introduced by Disraeli in 1867, and it's broadened in 1884. And between those 2 points, two things happen that the Bercows of this world hate. You first of all make the party system rigid. MPs stand on a party manifesto and on a party ticket.
Shopping basket policies.
And they are not elected as individuals. The only way you can have a moral standing as an individual, the Burkean claim, is if you actually were voted for as a particular person and not as a member of Parliament. And people like Dominic Grieve, who parade their honour, have been utterly and fundamentally dishonest. They stood on a party ticket, they stood on a party manifesto, which said better no deal than a bad deal, and they never uttered a peep against it. In other words, they have no moral standing. So the structure of parties guarantees democracy. In other words, I'm afraid you cannot have democracy with the idea of an MP.
What do you blame for this, David Starkey?
Political parties are one of the things that actually holds MPs accountable to their electorates. This is the key thing, that you cannot have an MP parading, I am a free-thinking representative, and have democracy. I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that. And the other thing that gave, as it were, democracy power over Parliament is Erskine May. They are the rules of Parliament itself that give the government with a clear parliamentary majority control over the parliamentary agenda. So what you can see has happened since the catastrophe of May's general election defeat, well, not defeat, failure to win a majority, is that there's been a breakdown of party loyalties, and there's also been the deliberate attack by the Speaker and the judiciary on the rules that have governed parliamentary management. And of course, the Supreme Court has got in on the act. You referred to the prorogation as being wildly unusual. Sorry, you're just subscribing to trash. The John Major himself prorogued Parliament for 3 weeks to try to get
6 weeks or 5 weeks is
well, it's neither here nor there. The Labour government, outrageously, the 45 Labour government, explicitly broke parliamentary statute by prorogation. The original Parliament Act required an act to be brought back over 2 parliamentary sessions. What did they do? Well, they did the opposite. They had 2 parliamentary sessions of, I think it was 4 days and 5 days, respectively. You know, and they drove a coach and horses.
So is the problem here, David Starkey, and forgive me interrupting.
Oh, you're allowed to now.
Is it that MPs are forgetting why they're there? They're meant to represent the people.
Absolutely it.
That's the point.
They've got above their station. And I blame paying MPs. I absolutely blame paying MPs, because this gives them the notion they've got a job. MPs don't have a job.
So stop paying them.
Well, I would like to do that, actually. No, I'm being really serious, because, again, this prioritisation of the backbench MP. The backbench MP is a stooge. Or they have got another. Traditionally, you know, you were at the bar, you were employed in business, you were a trade union activist or whatever, and you turned up and you voted as your party tells them to. By the way, Gilbert and Sullivan is the best on this. The Iolanthe, which is written in the 1880s, is the satire on the new Parliament. You know, every boy and every girl that's born into this world of mine is either a little liberal.
Start singing.
No. It's my voice is about 4 octaves too high for private. Let's get it down.
But that's the point, isn't it? That they've got to understand why
they're there and why Parliament survives. There was a very good letter in the Times, if I'm allowed to mention that recently, you can cut it out, which pointed out that the actual authority, not simply of individual MPs and standing of individual MPs, but of Parliament itself, and the House of Commons in particular, is now in doubt after its behaviour in the last 2.5 years. If Parliament behave as they've done, being deliberately obstructive and stopping anything happen, they are abolished. You see, the Americans have solved the problem to an extent by providing for direct election by the executive. And there's one way you could see our constitution adapting to the situation in which it now finds itself. You've got an aggressive legal establishment and Supreme Court. You've got clearly an element in the House of Commons that wants to take the select committees further, that wants to give MPs a role as criticising the executive. The only way you could make that work would be if we'd a directly elected Prime Minister. And I think there's actually an awful lot to be said for that.
Well, we're going towards that. Look, may I mention the Liberal Democrats?
I prefer you didn't.
I may have to. The election bus...
It's unpleasant,
the election
the
bus,
odour is disagreeable.
The election bus, David Starkey, says, vote for Joe Swinson, apostrophe S, Liberal Democrats, and a big face on the bus.
Yes.
Which is, and it goes to the very heart of this
Boris
point.
Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. That we already have effectively the House of Commons, when it works properly, acting as an electoral college for the position of Prime Minister. That's what it's really about.
Extraordinary.
We have another great problem is that because of the, on the whole, very poor quality of people standing for Parliament, it means that our executive, the cabinet, is generally speaking spectacularly weak at administrative and intellectual skills. I mean, you look at both front benches, frankly. The Labour front bench is indescribable. I mean, the idea of Jo Swinson as Prime Minister, for heaven's sake, you could imagine her running a rather preachy primary
Do you think,
school.
though, that it's because as we get older and the police get younger, we think they're all just like young people?
I always refer to people as your age as still being in
No,
nappies.
but you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean.
When you're younger, you look up to older people, and perhaps as you get older, you look down.
I mean, and there has always been criticism of the quality of the Commons, but you actually look on both benches. You look at the calibre of Thatcher's cabinet. You look at the calibre of Wilson's cabinet, and the range of people, what they'd written, what they'd thought, what they actually did. You look again in obviously the Second World War, this moment of national crisis. But the thing that's really astonishing about that is we did two things. Okay, we fought a war and we won it, and you'd have thought that would have occupied everybody. But we were also thinking consciously about the new institutions that are going to be created afterwards.
What do you blame for this? Do you blame social media for the rise of the cult of the individual over the collective benefit? Let me finish the question, because I've covered politics for 10 years for the Telegraph directly. I was fascinated by the sheer number of Tory MPs who thought they could be party leader, and the vanity of it. And I was also struck by people to walk up to me in the past 12 months and say, what do you think? Have I got a chance? And I'd look at them and go, what for? And they'd be clearly they were saying, have I got a chance to be party leader? And I would be thinking, is no one telling you the reality of your position? Do you not have a partner who can whisper in your ear?
But Chris,
Twitter makes them believe they can all be Prime Minister.
It's not only Twitter. There are two things. Theresa May became Prime Minister. Now, you will have read the biography.
Yes.
There it is, Anthony's masterpiece.
Anti-Seldon in my hand.
It is a masterpiece of emptiness. If Theresa May could
That's not his fault, though.
No, it's not. It's Theresa May. If somebody is awful, as completely unsuitable, without a single political talent, you will have sat next to her. And she is like a dose of ice-cold water poured over enthusiasm. She is a kind of permanent vacuum, an utter emptiness. Now, if somebody like that can become Prime Minister, anybody can become Prime Minister. But the business of individualism, I think there are two aspects to this. Both right and left is to blame. Thatcher, despite all her genuine belief in society, with her remarks, with the constant pushing of economic self-betterment, and also the breakdown of traditional structures. I look back at my parents' generation, their participation in churches, in trade unions, in walking clubs, in swimming, the whole thing, that has gone. And then, of course, the left itself has espoused all these doctrines of radical individualism on the one hand and divisive group rights on the other.
Do you think it says so much that we have journalists running the country? Now, I'm proud to be a journalist, but I do think I write about things rather than doing it. But you have Boris Johnson.
You had Michael Gove.
And these are people who... They're not like what you're describing as, someone who's had a career outside of Parliament, of business. They are basically observers and critics.
Churchill was a journalist, so we do have.
Well, no, perhaps that's fine.
No. Let me explain. You see, I think Churchill is fascinating. If you look at clearly Boris imagines he's Churchill. Look at the comparison. Churchill spends most of the 1930s not simply moaning about Germany and sitting on the back benches. He spends it writing a 3-volume biography of his great ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough, in which he works out all the moral positions of the Second World War, because he sees Louis XIV as the direct ancestor of the hegemonic regimes of Hitler and of Stalin. In other words, he works out serious thoughts. I'm afraid Michael Gove and Boris are both very clever men, govern as though they were writing a weekly column. They have a rush of blood. They have an idea to the head. I mean, Gove repeatedly. I mean, you look at what he did in education and all the rest of it. You have a bright idea. There's a flashing light bulb, and that becomes policy. Now, I know I am a good journalist too. It's how you write a 1,000-word article. It ain't how you govern a country of 65 million people.
So you want more serious people, don't you? Do you think, in a sense, that political beliefs fill the space left by religion? In our modern discourse.
The passion about them does. I think this is particularly true on the left. the belief in racism, belief in ecology.
What do you mean belief in racism? What does that mean?
In racism as the absolute test of moral failure. What you've done, racism now becomes the equivalent of original sin. And also the way that the left pursues language. It behaves, like a grand inquisitor. If you use minutely the wrong word, you are burned alive on Twitter. That's a form of religious passion. Similarly, look at the role of Greta Thunberg, whatever she's called. The Middle Ages is filled with child saints and intelligent adult people like Michael Gove prostrating themselves before them. God speaks through the voice, through the mouths of babes and sucklings. The voice speaks. And it is frankly mad.
Do you think that Greta Thunberg is a cynical...
I don't think she's cynical at all. No, I think she's childish and silly, and adults, which should still exist, are fools for treating her seriously. But you see, it also goes along with the sentimentality. It goes along with Dianification. It goes along with putting little teddy bears on war memorials. There's this whole... But again, you see, this is also medieval, offering up gifts at the shrine.
We're approaching Remembrance Sunday. Do you think we are slightly going over the top with the way we memorialise death and war? I mean, I think it's got more and more dramatic and bigger the further away we get from major sacrifice.
And the further you are from the reality of the thing and the knowledge of the horror and the knowledge of the ambiguity.
Why is that,
of
David
war.
Starkey?
Well, because I think it's that, again, it's become a quasi-religious ritual. It's become abstracted from reality. It also is, there is what we call poppy fascism, we're both suffering from it. The absolute requirement to do it. And it's also associated again with something else. We're turning soldiers into either victims or heroes. And the two sort of uneasily shift round each other. They're neither. Save if you have mass war and conscription, today's soldiers are volunteers. They are doing it usually because they like it and they get tremendously excited about it, and many of them just enjoy killing. And that's very useful. But again, you see, we don't want to admit any of those things. They don't go with the cosy suburb. They really don't. They are non-cosy thoughts. So we have to put it with this great deal of lipstick and varnish and scent over it. And it applies, again, you see, I think this applies to so much of our public life. There is this refusal to call things by their proper names. There's a refusal even to address the fundamentals of a notion of the national interest. To talk about the national interest now is the equivalent of farting in public. I mean, what is truly astonishing is Boris isn't using this. You have this wholly incoherent conservative position at the moment. We've got Brexit on the one hand, and then we've got an awful lot of policies which are designed to make the C2s feel that we're on side.
They're quite left-wing policies, aren't they, David?
Well, I think... Again, I think Boris is repeating all the mistakes of both Theresa May with Nick Timothy and also of David Cameron's modernisation. What Tory modernisation, the whole preposterous notion of Tory modernisation, was to make the Tory party the party of preference for readers of The Guardian. This is an idea so stupid that I'm afraid you have to use a very strong word and say it is stupid. And it doesn't work. And also it's unhistorical. You see, it's not addressing what Disraeli was about.
One Nation Tour. Well, there
are two versions, right?
Yeah, I knew you were getting trouble there.
There are two completely different ways of approaching One Nation Toryism. One Nation Toryism, in its modern form, was Tory appeasement towards what the Labour government of 45 did. That's what the One Nation group was about. That's what people like Nicholas Soames regard themselves as.
And Nick Timothy.
Nick Timothy. What is much more interesting is what Disraeli thought. Disraeli sees the Tory party as a natural alliance between the elite, the aristocratic elite, and the working class against the middle class. He sees the middle class as being interested, of which an absolute typical example would be the former Chancellor. And dear Philip Hammond is a classic illustration of an authentic, all-purpose, hard-nosed, bitter liberal. They only know money.
Is he better off at the party?
Very much better. These are the people who, Oscar Wilde put it in that wonderful single line, they know the price of everything and the value of nothing.
David Starkey, it's been fantastic to have you on the podcast.
Okay, shut up.
It's a David Starkey special. Will Brexit be a good thing in 20 years' time? Where do you sit on this?
Look,
a value judgment now. Come on, call it.
I hate doing this, as I said, because you're asking two separate questions. As a historian, I can't answer that question. I can only speak why I voted for it. I voted for it because I believe, along with my ancestors of countless generations of Englishmen and English women, that fundamentally self-government is what defines you as English. It's why the American colonies rebelled. It's why we created, in the wake of the American Revolution, this unique empire which regards self-government as being the natural target. So it's the only empire to spawn Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and whatever. That is built into being English, and I hope British, and Europe cannot adapt to that.
David Starkey, it's been a tour de force. It's been fascinating to have you on. Thank you for coming on Chopper's Brexit Podcast.
A pleasure.
And thank you very much to you for listening, and to the show's producers, Theo Ludis and Elliot Lampitt. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe and please leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find this podcast. If you want to get in touch, please tweet us at Brexit Broadcast and email us choppersbrexitpodcast@telegraph.co.uk. And don't forget, you can get 30 days free access to the entire Telegraph website by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. We'll be back later this week with more guests from the Red Lion pub. Always buy your copy of the Daily Telegraph. You know it's worth it. Until next time, cheerio!
Hello, I'm Mick Brown, and I write for the Telegraph magazine. That means I spend my days with my head deep in books and trawling Google and writing profiles, interviews, and investigative stories. This year I've been writing about psychedelic drugs as a possible cure for the world's greatest public health crisis, depression. And in a world exclusive with my colleague Robert Mendick, I tracked down and exposed India's most wanted man, the diamond dealer Nirav Modi, who was accused of embezzling $2 billion from one of India's biggest banks. But stories like these take time, and as we all know, time means money. That's where our subscribers come in. Without them, we just can't write the stories you enjoy reading or make podcasts like this one. So if you'd like to support what we're doing and to get unlimited access to the huge range of quality journalism on politics, business, lifestyle and more, go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where we have a special listener offer. You can get 30 days free access to the Telegraph online, and then after that it's just £2 a week. That's telegraph.co.uk/chopper, or click on the link in the show notes to this episode.